I guess we should probably get started with like the main thing. What is software heritage, and what is the sort of primary goal of the organization?
Okay, so Software Heritage is an initiative we created 10 years ago with my colleague Roberto Di Cosmo. And the short stated mission of Software Heritage is to collect, preserve, and share all software we can find in source code form.
Mhm.
This is the short pitch. So basically, the idea is that there is value in software source code. There is value even if you don't want to run that piece of software. Okay, there is cultural value, there is technical value, there is a lot of effort that went into creating that software, and we don't want that value to be lost for future generations. We can get to why it is at risk later if you want. And so the initiative of Software Heritage is precisely collecting as much of that software as we can, store it in a way that it will, make it available ideally forever for future generations, and actually give access to it to everybody. Everybody who needs access to that can be people for doing technical stuff, can be people, to resolve dependencies that no longer resolved today, can also be scientists like me that want to run an experiment on the largest body of software source code that is available today that happens to be stored in the Software Heritage Archive.
As sort of a, I guess, easy comparison, in my video I compared it to the Internet Archive for source code effectively.
Yes, so that is a common comparison, and we are good friends with our, let's say, colleagues in digital preservation at the Internet Archive. We feel like we are basically pursuing the same mission specifically for software source code. So that means that we do things a little bit differently. So in particular, when I say source code, we actually not only preserve the source code itself, like the files and the directories that you commonly have when you have a piece of software on your machine, but we actually preserve the full development history. So for instance, if we have archived a Git repository and that Git repository disappears, we can actually reconstruct it. If it is altered in some malicious ways from some attackers, we can actually detect that and reconstruct it to any previous state we have safeguarded. And this is true not only for Git. I mentioned Git because it's the most popular, version control system today, but we do the same for Subversion and for other popular version control systems. And so what we do differently from something like the Internet Archive is basically we also create a global data model in which essentially all the history of development, all the histories, plural, of development on the software archive are intertwined together. So we're sort of creating the global public Git repository. It is, of course, not stored like that because it would not scale, stored that way, but that is the general idea. So in a sense, if a website disappears, you go to the Internet Archive to actually find it and reconstruct it. If a version control system repository disappears, you come to us for the same purpose, essentially.
So I guess from someone who is a developer, you might understand like why a development history is important. But for someone who might not be, why does that matter?
Yes, so it matters because to make sense of a piece of software, the development history is fundamental. For instance, it's very common for developers to look at what is called the annotation or the blame of a file and see who is the last person that changed a specific line in a file. And if you want to know that, you need the full software history. And when you see who is the person who last touched a single line of code, you can look at what is called a commit, so which is basically the last recorded change that has touched that line. And a commit comes with a bunch of very useful additional information, metadata if you want. A commit comes with information about who did that, when that change was made, and a very precious human-targeted message that essentially the developer used to describe what the change is about. So essentially, the version control history give you the context on when a change happened and what it was about. So that's very precious information for everybody who wants to look at, why things were done and the history of something.
Yeah, right now I've got my terminal file manager open as an example in the history, and you can even though this is something which is it's on GitHub right now, you can publicly see it. This is something that is still being preserved. So it's not necessarily just stuff that no longer exists. It's you want to preserve it whilst it is still here, so that if any point somewhere along the line it disappears, you already have everything there. It's not a matter of trying to sort of dig back through and sort of piece things together where there might not be that sort of preserved history anymore?
Absolutely. So two things about this. So first, indeed, we proactively archive things. So we do not wait for someone to ask or say something to do that. So GitHub is an example, is one of the forges we periodically crawl to archive software. It's not the only one. So for instance, we have many GitLab instances or other development platforms. So we proactively do that. And the reason why we do that is that indeed, when something disappears, it might be too late to preserve it. It sounds obvious, but actually it's not so easy to know in advance. So we might discover essentially too late that something was important. And the only way to avoid, not having archived it when it was still available is to actually do that, which is precisely what we do.
Right. I think the work that is being done here is like really cool. And it did kind of bother me that so few people seem to like know about this existing. How long has the organization been around for at this point?
So the initiative itself started 10 years ago. Then the organization has been different because in the beginning, we were essentially an incubation project at a research institution here in France, because both me and my colleague were from that research institution, which is INRIA. But now we are essentially part still there, part at an independent foundation that is hosted at the INRIA Foundation. And that came about a bit later. So the work is in 10 years old, which seems like a lot, but we actually started very small. So in the beginning, we were, 2 researchers and 2 engineers working on that. Today, we are a team of more than 20 people. So it's growing slowly, because it's also important to mention that we are a non-profit initiative. So we believe we're doing this for the public good, for future generation. So it's not like VC funded. So we didn't have that kind of fast kickstart in terms of funding, and it's growing organically. And we think this is a very healthy, way of growing and actually not overstretch ourselves.
Right.